Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on AB 2635. And thank you, Carson, for your help convening the call. I want to go ahead and introduce Margaret Fortune, but first just want to let folks know a little bit about why CCSA decided to step up to the challenge of sponsoring legislation that we believe will begin to bring this state and the public education system within California closer to closing the equity and achievement gap, particularly among African American students. So we recognize that as a significant interest within the public education space in California, we occupy 10% of overall enrollment in California, and we also have something to say about our delivery model and what we've been able to do with vulnerable student populations, and also what it costs to actually intervene in meaningful ways so that those kids can ultimately succeed. And so we feel like we need to raise our hand and be a leader on equity issues that impact not only charter schools, but the broader public education space in California. And we've made that shift in large part because of the leadership of our new board chair, Margaret Fortune, who is the CEO and founder of Fortune School. Many of you are familiar with her school's mission. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about that and the content of the bill. Margaret?
Thanks so much, Carlos, and thank you everybody for joining the call on what we think is a really critically important issue, not just for public charter schools, but for all public schools serving kids and looking to do so in a way that closes achievement gaps and deals with issues of equity. I founded Fortune School, which is a network of public charter schools in Sacramento and San Bernardino, focused on closing the African American achievement gap. Before I came to be a charter operator, I was an education advisor to 2 California governors and served as assistant secretary under then Secretary Gary Hart, who, when he was a senator, as we all well know, authored the Charter School Act. And one of the things that was important to Senator Hart at that time was that charter schools be the research and development arm of the public school system. That was a part of the original concept. And I do believe, based on what he shared with me, that it has grown beyond his wildest imagination. But I do hold dear that idea that we have a responsibility to not just ourselves as a charter school movement, but also to be informative to public schools. And so it's with that spirit that we enter into this space of talking about equity in the local control funding formula through AB 2635. So what I'm going to share with you today is really a case for action for African American students. We are all known for our work with the most vulnerable students in the public school space, and a group of students that charter schools have particularly excelled with, where the traditional public school system has struggled, has been with African American students, who are the lowest performing subgroup outside of students with special needs. So let's take a look first at the Equity Coalition. If you could go to the next slide, please. That we have formed. And you see a few of the members of the coalition there. This bill is being authored by Shirley Weber, Autumn Burke, and Mike Gibson. These members are all members of the California Legislative Black Caucus, who has adopted AB 2635 as one of their major legislative agenda items for this year, and also the ask, which we'll get to a little later, as a part of their main priority in terms of their budget ask of the governor. You also see that we have a statewide coalition, which we're calling our Equity Coalition, that includes organizations like the Black Parallel School Board, the California Association of Black School Educators, the California Black Chamber of Commerce, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, as well as various chambers of commerce. And we also see supporting this and co-authoring this bill the Greater Sacramento Urban League, and in fact all the urban leagues, including the LA Urban League in the state, have joined as co-sponsors. Now, interestingly, you'll see as a supporter of this bill the California School Boards Association. we usually see them in court, but here we see them side by side with us on a very important equity issue. If we could go to the next slide. Next slide, please. There is a significant resource gap. I always like to know how big is the breadbox. So there are about 350,000 African American students in California. And when the local control funding formula was originally made, the thought was that the state of California would get at African American students in need of instructional assistance by talking about income. And while that did address 74% of the population, in other words, 260,000 students who receive a supplemental grant under the local control funding formula because they're low income, foster or homeless youth, or English learners, it left out 26% of this population, and that's 90,000 African American students who are ineligible for local control funding formula supplements, despite the fact that African American students as a subgroup that's recognized in the Education Code is the lowest performing subgroup of students that are not supported by supplemental state grants. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the data. What you see on this slide is evidence that African American students are underachieving when compared to other peer groups. The blue bar is their performance in English language arts, and there they are at 31% meeting standards in the 2017 state test results on the SBAC, and then the orange bar is the performance in math, where we have 19% of African American students meeting standards. You can see that they are below low-income students, and they're the lowest performing subgroup. All students in the state are performing at about 49% meeting standards and 38% in English language arts and 38% meeting standards in math. Let's take a look at the next slide. This slide is really important because it shows you the performance of students when you consider income. It's important that this graph is in color because the green bars represent student groups that are funded under LCFF with an extra supplemental grant, which turns out to be about worth about $3,000 per student. You see that low-income African American students, and this is math performance, are coming in at the bottom. The black bar represents all students. The African American unfunded group is the only blue bar, and those are unfunded students, those represented in the blue bar, where the students perform below average. Let's take a look at the next slide for English language arts. Just like with math performance, you see unfunded African American students underperforming all students. They're the only unfunded group where you see students performing below average. And remember, the point of the local control funding formula was to recognize that there are groups of students in our state that require additional resources because they're underperforming. And it identified three such groups: English learners, low-income students, and foster and homeless youth. But here in the case of African American students, we see that they are underperforming, yet the schools that serve them, public schools and public charter schools, do not receive any additional funding despite the need for additional interventions with this particular population, whether or not they are low income. Let's go to the next slide. In our current discussion of school accountability, there's a lot of talk about multiple measures. So it's worth taking a look at how African American students perform on various indicators. And so here you look at cohort graduation rates, and you see that African American students have the lowest cohort graduation rate. Let's turn to suspension. African American students have the highest suspension rates. So any way you cut it, African American students are the lowest performing subgroup outside of students with special needs. Let's take a look at the next slide and again say, how big is the breadbox and what would it take to fund this group of students? We're talking about 90,000 unfunded African American students that do not currently qualify for a supplemental or concentration grant. We think that the evidence shows that this group of students ought to, based on their performance. That if the state decided to fund that group, it would be an additional $360 million in state funding. Now, in this particular budget year, that is a modest ask. In this particular budget year, we have $2 billion extra dollars that are Prop 98 dollars that must be spent on public schools after the local control funding formula is fully funded 2 years ahead of schedule. So there's going to be a lot of opinions about how those extra resources ought to be directed. We think it ought to be directed towards the lowest performing students in the state, consistent with the spirit of the local control funding formula. Let's go to the next slide. So as a reminder, the groups that are currently recognized as high needs are English learners, low-income students, and foster and homeless youth. What AB 2635 would do would be to add the lowest performing subgroup that is not already receiving a supplemental grant or federal funding that is specifically targeting them. Let's go to the next slide. So it would add essentially a fourth category. And that group of students, as we discussed based on the 2017 data, is African American students. And AB 2635 would have the first group of students identified based on the 2017 data. Now, besides the extra money that we're talking about to fund interventions for this lowest performing subgroup to the tune of $360 million, why does it matter that students are identified and recognized by the state as high needs? Well, it matters because public schools are held accountable for that based on the LCAP. If a student is not high needs, then public schools really are not held to the same degree of accountability to explain exactly what they're going to do to serve that particular group of students. So we have 90,000 students sitting outside of the high need category who, by all accounts and looking at the data, clearly are high needs. So it's important in terms of school accountability, in addition to funding, that this group be identified and recognized as the high need students that they actually are. Let's go to the next slide. Now, since Pete Wilson was governor in the 90s and Californians voted on Prop 209, which ended affirmative action in the state and said you basically can't talk about race in public policy, including with public schools. Anytime you really attempted to target something towards African American students, people would hold up the stop sign and say, yeah, wait a minute, what about Proposition 209? This bill, AB 2635, actually refers to this group of students not by their race, but by their performance. There's no mention of race in this bill. As a matter of fact, if it's the case that African American students do better, the current group that is the lowest performing subgroup, then the next group would be identified for extra assistance, and we think that's fair. Now, there are some that would say, well, my goodness, if African American students, after decades of history of underperforming, do marginally better, then do we stop performing them? Then do we stop, supporting them? And do we actually create a perverse incentive to undermine the achievement of African American students just for schools to hold on to their funding? Well, AB 2635 has a remedy for that. The bill language says that the initial group that is identified will continue to have funding until their performance matches the performance of the highest performing subgroup. And that's the gap closing language that's in this bill. Now, the language that says that everybody's vote will rise is the language that says that the superintendent of public instruction will every year identify what group is the lowest performing subgroup. Based on the data, we anticipate that next subgroup will actually be Native American students to the tune of 11,000 students who are currently unfunded, but would be the next lowest performing subgroup. Let's take a look at the next slide. So who stands to gain? There's some curiosity out there in the world of traditional public schools as to why the Charter Schools Association would be supporting this legislation, and we've told you why. It's an equity issue. And as chair of the board, I think it's really important that we use our influence, and our influence is considerable, to advocate for the interests of the students who are in the most need, whether or not they're in public charter schools. That's a part of our obligation, really, our ethical obligation as educators in this space. So actually, the main winners in this are traditional public schools who serve the vast majority of African American students. And you can see on this table, LA Unified has over 10,000 unfunded African American students, which would generate an additional $50 million for the district. Oakland has 2,500 unfunded African American students, which would generate an additional $12.6 million for students in the district. You see there San Diego Unified, and one of our authors, Shirley Weber, is from San Diego. Over 2,000 unfunded African American students, and that would generate $10.5 million for the San Diego Unified School District. So this is, there are more school districts, of course, that would get funding. This particular cut looks at the 13 districts that serve over 1,000 unfunded African American students. Now, I'll stay here for just a minute to say, where I'm from in Sacramento, a couple of our districts are on this list. Elk Grove Unified, that stands to gain $10 million. Sacramento City towards the bottom, that stands to gain $5.3 million. And San Juan Unified, that stands to gain $1.5 million. Something that has been occurring in our current political climate in the schools, in the community where I'm from, is an uptick in racial incidents that have been reported in the news, where African American students are feeling alienated and discriminated against. It has been it made big headlines in Sacramento. And I can't help but wonder how different that conversation would be if the school boards that are having those conversations with the advocates of African American students were not only discussing the problem, but how they could use these additional resources to help solve the problem. I think it could be a unifying factor in those conversations, an acknowledgement that the changing climate in our country and therefore our schools is real, and a way not only to address academic performance, but also school climate, using local measures, because as we all know, the LCAP is locally driven. Let's take a look at another cut on the data about who wins. These are 16 LEAs in which the student population is 5% of unfunded African American students. So it gives you another indicator of where the money would go. Let's take a look at the next slide. Now, there are 16 charters who serve over 15% unfunded African American students. And so these charter schools are listed here. So we also want to point out that charter schools would get about 10% of the resources, which is proportional to our representation in the public schools as 10% of enrollment. All right, let's take a look at the next slide. Now, we are particularly poised in the charter school space to have a point of view on this. There are 12 schools in the state that serve a majority African American students that are in the top half of student performance and in the top 10% when compared to similar schools. You'll notice that if you go 3 columns over, it says, are they a charter, yes or no? And the answer is yes in 8 cases. This evidence of success ought to be an encouragement to all of us who care about this work. It can be done. We can accomplish high academic achievement, and many of our colleagues in this charter school space are doing the work and doing it to great success. And they're making sacrifices to do the work because their work is unfunded, even though the population of students that they're working with tends to do poorly in the system. So we believe that we can mine these schools for best practices so that when extra resources come for this unfunded population, we really have an opportunity to say, well, what works, and highlight the work not only in the 8 public charter schools that are on this list, but on the remaining traditional public schools as well. So let us go to the next slide. And we've basically covered what the solution is. AB 2635 would identify the lowest performing subgroup outside of students with special needs because they have a federal funding source for the purposes of directing supplemental grants to them. It would result in 90,000 unfunded students receiving funding. There is currently a discussion going on right now in the legislature, and it's a discussion that we support, around also supporting students with special needs that are not identified as high need students in the local control funding formula. That's a different discussion, and we think that both of these discussions need to be had. And given the resources to the tune of $2 billion that are available in this particular fiscal year, these ideas are not actually in competition with each other, but they are a complement to each other. This bill is going to be up for hearing on April 11th, and in Assembly Education. Let's take a look at the next slide. And we're going to be having a press conference and a committee hearing again on April 11th. So we ask you to save the date. I'd love to go to the last slide if we can, and encourage you, and you might want to just go ahead and take out your phone right now, to text LCFF to 52886 to email your personal legislators in support. Take your phones out and go ahead and text LCFF to 52886 and email your personal legislators in support. I've done it. I've walked through the process. It's a pretty nifty feature and easy to follow. Let them know that this is something that you support. And I'm proud of the equity coalition that we've built and the bridges that we've built with organizations that are typically our nemesis, are standing with us on this move to say, let's support our most vulnerable students, most notably the California School Boards Association. Carlos, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you.
Great. So you heard a little bit about what you could do immediately. We're really excited about the opportunity to make our case before the Assembly Education Committee on April 11th, and we plan to have a press event at 11:30 in the morning in the Capitol, followed by a policy hearing. And what's important to demonstrate is a united front where the members of the Assembly Education Committee know right off the bat that the folks who are in the room are supportive of AB 2635. So we will be getting T-shirts together and organizing folks so that we can make a visual statement in that regard. And as Margaret alluded to, one of the things that you can do immediately is to submit a letter to the Assembly Education Committee of support on AB 2635. I can tell you that when the letters that are included in the committee analysis are published, oftentimes, unfortunately, CCSA is an orphan, and we have, you know, sort of one opposition position or one support position on the record, and then you've got a litany of folks in support or opposition, but generally on the opposite side of us. And what we want to be able to demonstrate is that on this particular issue, there's a huge tent of folks in support of AB 2635. So to the extent that you can get a letter on letterhead to the Assembly Education Committee, it would certainly help reinforce the support. And we will be sending around a template letter for you to follow. And then, of course, we'd love to have you on April 11th. So if you are available, we'll be sending around details to the email that you all submitted when you registered for the webinar. I think we're going to go ahead and take questions. Carson, is that right?
So if you have any questions, you could enter your questions in the box on the right, or you could also raise your hand if we okay with the muting people?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you could also raise your hand and we can unmute you, and then you can, so I've got some people that have raised their hand, so let me try going. Crystal, are you there?
Hi, this is Crystal. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. So I had two questions. One, the data that you found for reasoning of why African American student data is so low, were there any huge indicators that you found that supported that? For instance, like chronic absenteeism, was that like something that showed that there was like a trend of that, and maybe that was a reason why?
We really didn't explore in the data, Crystal, the reasons why. We just reported the brutal facts based on the SBAC results. But what we haven't done here is an analysis as to why that is the case. But what we do know is that it's a historical trend, not just in California but nationally, that dates back to 1973. Like there are NAEP results going back to 1973 to show that African American students are at the bottom of student achievement. And we could all cite, I think, a variety of reasons, but that's not what we do here.
Got it. Totally get it. One thing that I was thinking is if this could be helpful for like a more holistic approach of understanding the ways in when we can like help impact. Say, for instance, like if we find that like chronic absenteeism is a reason because of like sickness and healthcare is the issue, like maybe making sure that we're also helping in those ways that like students are healthy enough to be in class to actually like get the results that they need on that SBAC. Like, I don't know, that's something that came to my mind. And I'm pretty sure that's like out of like the field that you were looking in, but that's something that came up to me. And then also too, just for like future steps, like I've already texted the information that you gave, but I also am interested to know, is this something that's gonna be like on a bill? Because I know personally, I live in Long Beach and we have voting coming up. Is this something that we can vote on as like citizens like in this community?
So it's going to be an AB 2635. That's the bill number. It's being authored by Shirley Weber of San Diego, Autumn Burke of Los Angeles, and Mike Gibson of Los Angeles. It's going to be heard, and maybe Carson, we can put up that slide for the hearing date, on April 11th in Assembly Education. This is a bill that also ties to the Budget Act. So the policy is in the bill, and the money it would have to be in the budget. And it's talking about $360 million towards this purpose, which is why it's important that the California Legislative Black Caucus is asking or has made it not only a legislative priority for them, but also a budget priority. We want this to be the one thing the Black Caucus says, we're going to hold up the budget for this. And so that's what it means for it to be a budget priority. But that's the action. It's happening the action is happening in the legislature, and then with the governor when it comes time to his decision about whether or not to sign this bill if it's successful in getting through both houses of the legislature.
Okay, I wanted to add, Crystal, what school are you from? And you're in Long Beach, it sounds like.
Yes, actually, so I'm a resident of Long Beach. However, I am no longer in the schools. I actually support different school districts, but I previously worked at a KIPP LA school. Okay,
all right. Well, if you are a constituent, the chair of the Assembly Education Committee is from Long Beach, and we believe is a linchpin vote on this bill on the 11th. So, your participation is absolutely welcome. Thank you.
Oh, right, thank you. I'll make sure I spread the word on that.
Trish, are you there?
Sorry. Trisha's hand was up.
Yeah, Trisha, I saw that your hand was up. Are you there? We unmuted you. Oh, maybe not. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? If you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you, or why? Okay. Then I think we're good. Oh wait, no, Lucretia, actually. There we go. Lucretia, can you hear us?
Yes. Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Hi, we can hear you.
I have a question. So, so you get the extra. So if this bill is if it's approved or passed, you get the extra money. Is there any research on what the money should be spent on specifically that is going to increase the achievement of the unfunded African American students and others? What are some leading programs or strategies or training, all of that? Have you been working on that so that the money can immediately be applied using research-based strategies that are known to make a difference?
Great question. So let's put back up the slide of the 12 schools that are performing in the state with this population of students. Okay. So there's a book called Closing the Gap, what Parents Educators Do. It was published in 2012, which is a study of high achieving schools that are serving high minority, high poverty populations. So that's one source of best practices. Many of the schools on this list were a part of that study. And there is we have done an additional set of case studies based on the most recent set of SBAC scores on these schools that are on this list. That's up on the screen now. Some of these lists are, have been highly celebrated by the California Charter Schools Association, like for example, Wilder's Preparatory Academy Charter. So we're going to be, so we have the information about these schools and what their best practices are, but the decision-making process under the local control funding formula is local through the local control accountability plans that districts and public schools are required to make with their local community. So we are proposing to lie on top of that existing infrastructure of current law. So the decisions really will be driven at the local level.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, does anybody else have any other questions?
If you want to participate, how do you participate? Other than writing the letters and texting.
Let's go back to the slide.
Yeah, sure.
For April 11th.
Yeah.
So we will go ahead and circulate an email if you submitted an email to us when you registered to make sure you receive a template letter of support, as well as more details on the press event in Sacramento on April 11th and the policy hearing on April 11th. And if you haven't already, we definitely encourage you to text 5288 LCFF to 52886 because what that will do is it will give you directions on how you can contact your member of the assembly directly, and we will also be able to retain your information. So those are things that you can do immediately. We'd love, of course, to have your participation on April 11th, and we will be circulating more details about that event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And if there are no further questions, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you.